morning, and again, welcome to Anthropology 4310. This morning, we're at kind of a turning point in the lectures because we're going to be going from the 19th century evolutionists and talking about 20th century anthropologists, believe it or not. Boaz and the American School will be getting there shortly. There are a few things I want to tie up still with the 19th century. And the last time we went over a handout, or finished a handout that I had given you on lectures, I think it turns out to be 4, 5, and 6, although originally it was intended to be 4 and 5, concerning the 19th century and their assumptions and their perspective, etc. And I think it's important for you to consider it and to give it consideration, because I want to ask you now, are there any questions that you have about anything that I have covered, whether it be over the 19th century classical evolutionist point of view, or whether it be anything I even covered before that? I have, in terms of an overview, I have given you, started off with Darwin's publication in 1859. I talked about Spencer, Tyler, and Morgan being preeminent for this period. I talked about those basic assumptions being psychic unity of mankind, parallel evolution, and a comparative method, or at least what we might call a comparative method. We talked about Morgan's theory of cultural evolution in particular, where he had these stages of cultural development: savagery, barbarism, and civilization. And we also talked about that at this time it's always useful to realize that people are answering other people. What academic scholarship is about, whether it's in print or whether it's over television such as this, it's an ongoing dialogue about the state of this craft, at least in our case, known as anthropology. And in the case of the 19th century evolutionists, they had two audiences other than their immediate one, and that would be theologians and that would be diffusionists. Now, at this point, any questions about any of those things? Yes, sir. Hit your microphone.
Okay. I might not be real clear on the distinction between diffusionists and classical evolutionists, because in the classical evolutionists' third assumption, they talk about how we have evidence of this evolution of culture because we today can look at certain cultures that still exist that are maybe, quote, more primitive, and they are evidence that, sort of fossils in a sense, right? And that seems to me to be a rather diffusionist point of view, because the fact that they were isolated allows them to remain more, quote, primitive. And again, that seems like if they had contact, which is the main element of diffusionism, then they would have evolved more quickly along with the rest of us.
Okay. You're correct to point out that one of the assumptions that I don't talk about, I think I mentioned it last time though, in terms of my discussion of progress and their notion of progress, the classical evolutionists did think that one group of people do progress at different rates. So the reason you can account for some people still being in the Stone Age, according to their point of view, is that they just haven't, quote, progressed as far. But if you give them enough time, if you leave them alone long enough, they would eventually have gone through those stages as the appropriate environmental encouragement came along. Because again, the first theory of psychic unity, humans placed in similar environments produce similar products in terms of culture. It does sound the same, but if you look at the underlying premises of both cultural evolution and diffusionists, they're actually vastly different from one another. Yes, the cultural evolutionists did take their third assumption, the comparative method, or what we're calling the comparative method, as proof that this evolutionary stages did exist, because we could find previous examples or earlier examples by looking around at the world's inventory of cultures, as it were. And you're saying if people come in contact, why wouldn't the diffusionist notion take precedence, or at least be given equal value, as an explanatory principle, because it would seem to fit. They don't accept the diffusionists, mainly because the underlying premise of both is vastly different. The underlying premise of diffusionists is that humans are by nature fundamentally non-innovative, non-inventive, fairly loathsome creatures. And in that context, then, they consider it the unusual, the exceptional, the whatever, for a person or a group of people to come up with this notion of agriculture, or to come up with a notion even of a refinement in Stone Age technology that made a tool more efficient or made it more effective in a greater variety of contexts, etc. So that these, people, that's the way humans were viewed by these folks. And I even referred once to the fellow who talked about chariots of something, chariots. What is it? Chariots of the gods. That he felt that in the New World especially, Native Americans could never have been so inventive as to have been responsible or given credit for the development of agriculture around the corn, beans, and squash complex. So he says they must have come from astronauts from outer space. And then he tries to show demonstrations of that in Cusco in Peru and other areas and sites in the New World. Well, that's a somewhat silly and use that we laugh and chuckle at that, at least those of us in our private quarters. But on the other hand, it's a fairly good rendering of the kinds of statements that diffusionists were making at that time. And the classical evolutionists, by contrast, and on the other hand, had a wholly different viewpoint of humans. Humans were seen as eminently substitutable for each other. They were seen as creative, innovative, progressive. Take the first assumption that that mankind everywhere exhibits similar mental characteristics. Consequently, if you place men everywhere or humans everywhere in a similar environment, they're going to respond in a like manner. Well, that's a fairly progressive statement. That kind of takes away all those factors that make one human group better than another, at least in terms of psychic qualities. And I don't mean transcendental psychic, I mean psychic in the sense of psychological or inner mind, or however you want to. Psychological, I think, is probably the best current word to use in usage of that psychic. It's not talking about somebody who can read palms. They're talking about the structure of the mind, the psychology of the mind. That essentially it's the same for all peoples everywhere. Be they Stone Age peoples existing in, say, Australia, or the area in the Philippines of the Tasadai, or whether they be Stone Age peoples living in South America, the Alca of Ecuador, I think I've mentioned on occasion, wherever and whenever they manifest themselves, they are seen as a stage in progressive development. And then the archaeologist looks at the level of technology that are found in the various excavations that are undertaken, and they come up with a notion that these people exist at a comparable stage of development that's been identified, I think, as I told you last time, in the scheme of things as found in Old World archaeology, in the Mousterian, etc., of the European context in archaeology and archaeological history. That it informs the rest of archaeology, I think, of the other parts of the world. Part of that is just due to timing. It was easier to do archaeology in the United States and in Europe than it was feasible to do it in all other areas of the world. Even today, in some cases for archaeologists, it's becoming increasingly difficult to get permission to certainly, once you have undertaken your archaeological excavation, you really aren't entitled to take your collection home with you, even if you belong to a museum and you're going to put it in a place for public display. No, that's a no-no. That's considered by most governments and other countries to be national treasures, and by rights and by law, to belong to them. So sometimes you can come up with an agreement or an arrangement, or you can take a sample of the artifacts, but the majority, or even all of them, would have to be held in trust by the national government that in whose country you're doing that excavation. But in earlier times, there's no really thoroughgoing, I think, archaeological reconstruction of Africa, for example, or any area of Africa. There's spotty reconstructions. There's aerial. Some areas are known better than others, but I would say that archaeology in the continent of Africa is just beginning. In terms of people doing it as a project that could anyway come near the sophistication of our knowledge about the archaeology of the old world in Europe. But again, the assumption here is that all humans are equal, substitutable. The individual really doesn't count here. And it's something that I'll be taking up with the beginning of my remarks today about that viewpoint, or that way of seeing things. Did I answer your question? Okay. Any other questions? Yeah.
I'm not sure where I read it, somewhere in these materials for this section, but it was about the definition of social Darwinism being that it can be construed either of two ways, and one is mistaken. And I think the one that's mistaken is using the words social and put in having an idea of Marx or communist theology.
I know what you're talking about. I said in lecture, I think it was, that, in fact, it was almost an introductory comment, that Lewis Henry Morgan is in the Hall of Heroes when the Soviet Union existed, and why such a person as Morgan would be included, given that we don't normally think of anthropologists being given such high honor, especially in that kind of context. And the reason being is that it wasn't social Darwinism they were talking about so much as a concept that Morgan used in his writings called primitive communism. And that was a phrase that he intended to imply the sharing among simple hunting and gathering people. Simple in the sense, again, of their technology. But the ideology, or the ideologues of the Soviet Union, took that to mean, and wanted that to mean, told themselves it meant that such a renowned scholar as Morgan, and he is renowned because everybody has read him. Maybe we haven't, but you have now if you've been going along, because there's an article that he's written. But, to think that his book, Ancient Society, I think published in 1871, I may have the wrong publication there, but just that gives you the time period. To think that people are still reading him today, and that it informs views that we have of human nature and human beings today, that's a big credit in terms, my tapes should go so long in history. They took it to mean that to be communistic in the ideological sense for Marxists, not scholars now, but ideologues, had to do or referred to sharing and the very nature of primitive society. So that these earlier examples of human beings coming to live in cultural groupings with one another then displayed something that could be called communistic. All he meant was that among simple hunting and gathering peoples, again, that there tends to be a greater emphasis upon sharing, upon reciprocity. A lot of primitive economies, and by primitive economies, again, we mean hunters and gatherers, have notions of reciprocity. And it's kind of an interesting notion. And it's one that, again, the ideologues in the Soviet Union kind of misconstrued. But it really means that there is this assumption that things are going to eventually work out to be equal. So if you get ahead today in terms of our exchange, economically, socially, whatever, politically, tomorrow I'll be ahead. So it doesn't really matter. Nobody really needs to keep a strict accounting. There's a notion that things do work out reciprocally, and that I don't have to really be concerned myself if I'm a member of one of those groups about staying equal with you. It's just going to be that way. That's the fundamental nature of the universe. And what's interesting is that seems to go from one culture to another. Among, again, what we call primitive cultures, it's the exception where such a group displays sufficient differences in the distribution of wealth. And I think, principally now, and we'll talk about them probably later, the Kwajalein of the northwest coast of the United States, where you do have this division into classes, you do have unequal distribution of wealth, and you don't have a people sharing in this fundamental assumption that there's a kind of a reciprocity to everything. But they're the unusual folks in all this. They're the exception. And it goes back, I suppose, to that cliche that doesn't have any scientific validity, but it seems to have the weight of tradition behind it in our own culture, and that is that, the exception proves the rule. So that's what it was about. Okay. Anyone else? Any other questions before I go on? Yeah.
2 lectures ago, you started to give us a quote from Morgan. Would you be able to complete that today?
It's one. I think he just said that evolution, cultural evolution, is one in. If this is the one you mean, one in progress, one in thought, one in progress, and one in. I tried to find it, couldn't find it, and one in. Pardon? Nature. Okay, but the important thing here is that there's a kind of unity to it all, and that a oneness. And it's that oneness, that monolithic structure, I guess, or a scheme for viewing cultural evolution that I think sometimes confuses people. It's the explanation for that similarity. And the reason that they were originally referred to as unilinear evolutionists, later they became referred to in more current times as multilinear evolutionists. And even here, I kind of shy away from either one of those and instead give you that the second assumption is parallel evolution. Because I think that's really the way to see it. It's almost a mystical notion, and I've been trying to find the article that I've read by Morgan, or the chapter, whichever it turns out to be, and I will find it before the semester's over, where he's talking about this parallel evolution, or this seemingly similar stages that people go through, and he's trying to account for that. Why does that occur? Why is it that people's anywhere and everywhere, if they're human, or even pre-human, proto-human, or whatever, some terms of our most immediate ancestors, meaning Neanderthals and maybe even earlier than that, although Homo erectus finds, I'm thinking Pithecanthropus, or at a later time, the Homo Neanderthalensis, or Neanderthal man, or humans, or pre-humans anyway. They seem to be very close to us. In fact, some biologists think that, and zoologists especially think that, the Neanderthals didn't go anywhere. They're right here. If you have a friend who's particularly hairy, who has the supraorbital brow ridges that are more developed than your own, more than likely they have some Neanderthal genes. So they weren't that distinct a population, even at the time when you go back to, if this were a course in human variation, and when we were going over the various fossil finds, you'd find that first you have classical sapiens, then you have Neanderthal, then you go back to Homo sapiens sapiens. And the truth is, I think, is that those populations are separate populations only in the biologist's mind. That essentially they weren't genetically distinct enough from each other to be classified in such distinctive categories. But again, they are distinctive enough at least to talk about, and they certainly do. But in that writing of Morgan, which I'm still, as I say, trying to locate, it's almost a mystical statement. That it's something in the psyche, it's something in the mind, it's something in the psychology of the mind that, and there wasn't a concept of genetics then. And that's what we have to remember in order to kind of take it back in history to see that it really is kind of mystical in the way he's talking about. Again, I think it goes back to the first assumption, the psychic unity of mankind. In the sense that he says it's almost like a necessary unfolding. And that's where I gave you that statement earlier about ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, that seemingly impossible statement to understand, which translated into English means something like... embryonic development recapitulates human racial history. And racial there can't be mean to mean Africans versus Caucasians versus some other group in the world, but rather racial here has to almost refer to national groups or tribal groups or something a lot more primitive in terms of its refinement at a conceptual level. But anyway, he feels that there's something about human minds that there's a necessary unfolding in there, that if those minds not separated from their bodies, but if they're placed in certain environments, there's a necessary stream of developments that are going to occur regardless of what the intent of the people would be. They would have to go through those stages, 3 stages of savagery, 3 stages of barbarism, and 2 or more or whatever stages of civilization as it turns out now. And that's an aspect of that theory that's sometimes overlooked, and it's something that most of us, at least I'm a little uncomfortable with, because I don't really feel there's like a computer program, software almost in here, or maybe it's hardware instead of software, that as a human, if I'm placed in a particular environment, this is just a necessary happening. There's no control over it. It's just going to occur. And that's why they really couldn't agree. I mean, having that kind of assumption, they really couldn't agree with someone like the diffusionists as he was asking about earlier. They didn't have such an assumption, nor was that their basic premise. I hope I answered your question. Anyone else? Okay, today we're going to, as I say, if you look at the end of that last handout that I gave you, it starts at the bottom of that handout and continues on the next page. And as soon as the camera focuses on that, I'll talk about it. It's that very bottom there. It says 3 names are commonly associated with the rejection of classical evolution. And among these are Franz Boas in the United States, and in England they would be Bronislaw Malinowski and A.R. Radcliffe Brown. Those are important names. I would expect you to know those names and be familiar with their particular theoretical points of view. All right, all 3 of these gentlemen agreed that the classical evolutionists were attempting to write history, and they pointed out that to write history of any civilization or of mankind at large required facts. And then we go into this notion that, which I think I've gone over this part of the handout before, but it's just to bring us back on track and to take us further. And that is they found that they have a very narrow view of history at this time. They thought that history is about reconstructing reality and not to anticipate modern generation of scholars, both in history and in anthropology and in the social sciences in general, but rather to talk about, these people didn't have that kind of notion, this other notion of history. They didn't accept it, rather, better said. They really felt that history was recovering fact. If I'm going to study the history of Germany, I have to go back and I have to recover what the facts in the history of Germany were. And that is what they felt history was about. And they felt, given the training that, for example, Boas and Malinowski and Radcliffe Brown had received, the kinds of folks they studied under, the different scholars, the commonly held assumption at this time was that history is about the recovery of fact. And they're going to be able to, and that's what history should be about, they think. So that this kind of view that the 19th century classical evolutionists had, this view of cultural evolution or classical evolution, is inappropriate because it's not based on fact. It's based on their acceptance of a group of assumptions that took precedence over fact, that preceded their recovery of fact. After all, in the 18th century, when some of these schemes of savagery, barbarism, and civilization were first presented, or at least earlier presented, there weren't that many people who had written anything about ethnographic descriptions of other peoples. They knew, for example, in the 18th century that there were Aztecs, and that the Spanish had come into contact with the Aztecs, or the Spanish had come in contact with the Inca in Peru, or that they had come into contact with differing peoples around the world, and they had differing kinds of cultures and cultural traditions. And again, but that's what they were trying to explain. They really had very little to go on, but they were trying to come up with a scheme for explaining what all humans were about, and they came up with that scheme of this notion of the progressive evolution or change in culture from one stage of development to another. If you really go back to the 18th and 19th centuries, you will find that they came up with a whole set of stages beyond this. And one of the reasons I use Morgan is it is simple, it is easier to accept or to at least to examine because it isn't quite so complicated. But you know, they had, I know one author had almost 20 different stages. And they didn't really have any explanation for why a group or a community or a culture of people would go from one stage of development to another, other than the kind of evasive reasons that I've given you already earlier today, or touched on. And one way they said it, and one that upset a great deal, a modern anthropologist by the name of Marvin Harris, he thought it made them despicable, is because they would say, well, first humanity thinks one way, and then it thinks in another. But again, given that kind of psychic unity, that kind of natural core in there of development, to go from one stage to another, it's all going to occur. You're going to have those different stages, you're going to have those different responses, you're going to have this scheme taking form and shape. But again, these folks just kind of assume this. They really didn't have a substantial ethnographic record to support it.
Does that mean that the similarities between the cultures, such as the Aztecs and the Incas, with their pyramids, with a mathematical prowess, as similar to that of the Egyptians, is explained more through parallel evolution? And if so, is there any explanation as to why other cultures, such as those that developed in Europe or in other parts of the world, did not also evolve through that type of building structures or mathematical prowess?
So your question is, I get the latter part. Say the last part again.
Well, if that's the...
I understand that you're talking about the similarity from say, Aztecs, Inca. Actually, you're thinking the Maya, I think, because they are the ones who had the mathematical sophistication that equaled any in the world at that time. And they also had a calendar that was more correct than the Gregorian calendar that was popular or acceptable widely in Europe at that time of contact.
So does that mean just the level, that particular process of evolution was bypassed somehow in Europe, or say in other parts of the world where that is not prevalent?
Okay, it's a good question. It's what the 20th century answered with. The 20th century anthropology, and I'll embed it in the context of the 20th century later, but just to answer your question, they felt that contact and diffusion was an important explanatory principle. And while they didn't accept the wide-scale, wholesale concept of diffusionary development of, there's a very few centers of innovation and invention that then disseminate their ideas and technology to the rest of the world, or in the case of Chariot of the Gods, from outer space to our world, that even though they can't accept that, in this later period in anthropology, you'll find out that diffusion is extremely important because there was an awareness that people are constantly coming into a contact with one another, and they exchange artifacts and ideas with one another, and they then establish a kind of cultural uniformity with one another if sufficient time has passed. So later on, they did come to think that groups of people could skip stages of development, but through contact or diffusion. So if today we encounter the Alca, and NASA goes there for, if they did, they don't, but say they did, which would be in the Oriente or jungle regions of South America and the Amazon area, but for Ecuador, then they could be brought into the 20th century or almost the 21st century right now. A son of an Alca could be going to the University of Houston and then become an astronaut, theoretically, in Clear Lake, or wherever they go, wherever astronauts come from. And that would be acceptable in today's terms. But this notion of parallel evolution was used to account for these various similarities. But sometimes the similarities were exaggerated, again, because they didn't have the facts. And just like you alluded to mathematical developments on the one hand, and you alluded to pyramids and things in terms of architecture on the other, sometimes there was a wider spread set of notions that there were these monumental megalithic structures that were similar from one area of the world to another, because they were looking for similarity. They were looking to see that human beings were exactly the same in different areas of the world, when in fact archaeology has long since shown us that those stone structures in Peru, for example, had nothing to do with the kind of stone structures that you had in Egypt. In Egypt, I think as most of you know, those kinds of structures were tombs. They housed the belongings and the wealth and the people that were closest to that pharaoh or that very important person. Whereas in Peru or in Mexico, whether you're talking about the Maya or the Aztecs in Mexico, they were never tombs. They had completely different kinds of functions in terms of the daily life and the ritual of those people, so that they really weren't the same. And they really were a product of the prehistoric and historic developments that occurred in each one of those major culture areas of the world. I think that may be a long-winded answer to your question. I hope it answered your question. Okay. Thank you for the question. Anyone else?
Yeah. I was just going to state that it took about half a century, it sounds like, for criticisms to arise, substantial criticism to arise that everybody heard, to evolution, the theory of evolution from the 1800s. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that it's, although you can criticize it now, it's respectable at the time. And when Boaz and others started to criticize, well, they're saying that, that was wrong, we have new ideas now. Well, this just keeps on going. Right now we have new ideas too, and of course what's old has become new again.
Well, that's
and what we're saying now may very well evolve into something else, some other theories that will make our beliefs now quite disrespectable.
Oh, already.
In the future, but right now, yeah. I mean, that's just a statement that occurs to me.
Yeah, it's a truism, or it goes from one generation to the next. It seemingly never changes, in the sense that what's acceptable today is unacceptable tomorrow, but what's unacceptable today is acceptable tomorrow. So it's that may be where our focus on evolution comes from. One of the things I would like you to do is to see that all of these are perspectives. All of these are projections from our minds, collectively speaking, onto what's out there. In a book that I use elsewhere in another class by Lett, a man named Lett, L-E-T-T, he asked the question, is there a reality that's separate from the observer? That's the basic assumption that can go from one generation of scholars to another, be they of one persuasion or another persuasion. There are, extreme humanists, I suppose, and there are, there's extreme everything, that would say that there is no reality apart from the perception of it. I personally can't accept that. I mean, I really do see that what science is about, what even humanistic scholarship traditions are about, is an assumption that there is a reality out there. This comes to us from positivism, by and large, that says that it can be looked at, it can be studied, it can be responded to, that's apart from your perception of it. Well, if that's true, if culture then, as a consequence, becomes largely, in each generation, a product or a byproduct of this perception, then we are creatures that impose our notions of reality onto reality. So there's always kind of a less than direct, we don't merge with reality, we view reality, and in our viewing of reality there are different views. So that one generation, and you're correct to point that out, at least in the 18th century and a large part of the 19th century, with that first half being given more over to theological discussions, there is this wholesale or widespread acceptance of cultural evolution. It was seen as the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the byproduct of the best that European scholarship had to offer. It was seen as throwing away the narrowness of theological perceptions, especially of Christianity and Judaism. It was seen as viewing human beings in a totally different way. I mean, one of the things we always seem to do in the West, there are the good guys and the bad guys. And if we didn't have that notion going across generations, we wouldn't have scholarship, I think, sometimes in this individualistic kind of notion of the world. So if I'm speaking today about a certain theoretical point of view, at the same time I'm putting down other folks. And the question I think to ask yourself to get the larger picture is, who are the different folks that are being put down at any one time, and who are the folks that are being elevated? Well, the folks that are being put down in the 19th century anyway were the theologians, or this simplistic theological perspective of humanity, and the diffusionists. And the diffusionists primarily were located geographically in Europe, whereas the kind of classical evolutionary point of view I'm talking about, at least in the latter part of the 19th century, is located primarily in England and the United States. And that's, we're mostly about American anthropology in here. Although one gentleman asked me early on in the course, aren't there other traditions of anthropology? Aren't there other historical perspectives? The answer is yes, but they didn't inform the world of anthropology as it operates currently in Europe, in Japan, say, it's kind of that Western hegemony, or whatever. We are the imperialists of our own discipline, meaning that our point of view is the only point of view, whatever that point of view may be at any one time. But, people who are the principal anthropologists, for example, in Japan, or sometimes in India, in Russia, in Europe, England, America, Mexico, South America, etc., wherever you want to say, they've primarily been trained by American universities or by other people who've been trained in American universities. So, for example, if you get a dialogue in Ecuador going on about scholarship at least in the 60s and 70s and even into the 80s, it was about showing the ways in which our view of anthropology, no matter which stage or chapter in history you're talking about, is really a product of capitalistic imperialism, and they wanted rather instead a more Marxist notion of scholarship in which it was seen as class struggle, and that's what all these archaeological depictions demonstrated. But again, that whole conflict, or viewing of the conflict, viewing of what the world is about, was embedded in the Cold War environment of the 20th century. And that's how it came to be viewed in that context. And that's where, sometimes Marxist scholarship was distorted, because that isn't what Marxist scholarship refers to when academics use it today. It's a much more sophisticated viewpoint. It even goes beyond Marx. But anyway, hope I answered your question. Okay, so anyway, you have these three people, and they will be what we will be covering now up until the exam. So we're going to be focusing on their ideas and contributions for quite a while. Obviously, because this goes through October, I think. Isn't the exam on the 14th or something like that? Whatever. I'm not supposed to mention dates, and I just did. But sometime, in about a month from now, there will be your first exam, and we will by that time have covered the contributions of Boas, of Malinowski, and Radcliffe Brown. We will have looked at the American School of historical particularism, and then later cultural relativism, and also the British school of anthropology, which oftentimes is either called functionalism or structural functionalism. And that will then set the basis for us to look at all those other points of view that many of you are going to be taking up in your presentations for your television debuts. Okay, there's one other notion that kind of transcends all of these various attempts. So before I go to intermittent liberal reform or Boas in the American school per se, I want to talk about the contributions of one student of Boas, his notions of the superorganic. If I can find it here. Here we go. It's right here on top. And again, for those of you in class, this will be distributed later. And whenever we find out the mysticism or the whatever, the secret ways of putting something on the internet, all of these handouts that I've been talking about will be made available to you in the home audience. I look at my little monitor here and think I'm looking at the people in the home. But it's actually probably when I look up this way that I would be looking at the people at home. Anyway, again, if the camera will focus on my handout here, it's about the concept of the superorganic. And the concept of the superorganic in some ways refers to that notion I was just talking about of Morgan's, of this almost natural unfolding, or this ontogeny recapitulating phylogeny. It comes to us from positivism in some ways. On the one hand, I see it as mystical and kind of the statements. Mystical, I think I may mean mysterious rather than mystical, technically speaking. And on the other hand, it comes to us from positivist assumptions about the nature of the universe and the scientific method to be utilized for studying different aspects of the universe. For example, they had to get off the handout for a moment, they had a really structured view of how things should be done, these positivists, and it was also part of their contribution. We're going back now to the 18th and 19th centuries, right? This notion that when the Enlightenment was making its mark, when it was being made a prevalent point of view, they added to it, these positivists did, that there were certain levels of reality that were out there. And each level of reality had its appropriate academic discipline. And you got to remember, this was at a time when universities were being established. There was a great growth of intellectual scholarship at this time compared to previous periods. There was new universities coming to being. When I think of the United States, my own university where I was trained, University of Illinois, I think it was either the state, I guess it was the state, came into the Union in 1818, and the university came into being somewhere in the latter part of the 19th century, 18-something, the 60s or 70s, something like that. And the University of Houston, of course, is much later. It's a much more recent development. Its earliest time, I think, was 1934. It was late on the scene, and one of the reasons why it was never considered, quote, a land-grant school like Texas A&M. I don't know when the University of Texas came into being, but I would suspect that it was a time similar to the University of Illinois and other major state universities around the country. So, if you were talking about a level of reality that was totally inorganic, I'll even do a little written thing here. It's going almost to another stage thing. But I don't want to cloud your mind or encumber your mind with this, but I just think you should at least have heard about it. So if you're talking about the level of reality out there in the real world that we sometimes refer to as the inorganic, which would be the study of rocks, for example, that's inorganic. There's nothing living associated with it. There's nothing organic associated with it. And the appropriate tools to do that would be the disciplines of mathematics and physics. Physics is the natural area of specialization if you're interested in studying a level of reality known as the inorganic. This is astronomy. Largely astronomy, it's assumed, is about inorganic presentations of reality. So if you're looking at the stars 34 million light years away, or if you're looking at planets of one of the other stars, that we're discovering all the time, you're primarily looking at inorganic reality. So if you're talking about quasars and black holes and all those things that astronomers talk about, you're really talking about what physicists talk about, which is, astronomy can be seen as a subfield of physics. You're really talking about this level of reality, primarily that we refer to as inorganic. So the discipline of physics goes there. What else goes with that? Just like Morgan stages. Well, another thing goes with that is that this is also the field of study, or the level of reality, that is most commensurable, most studyable, if those are words, by the scientific method. So whatever science has to say, whatever mathematics going along with that science has to say, best fits this study of the level of reality that is talked about here. When we go to other levels of reality, science becomes increasingly incapable or ill at ease in discussing that level of reality. So we have physics and math here. I'll just put PHY to stand for physics, and I'll put math right under it. If you're a social science and you really want to be spiffy in the world of social scientists, you claim that your social science is all about mathematical equations. Thus, you see economists talking about their superiority over anthropologists. Everybody says they're superior to anthropologists because they're all about mathematical equations, and anthropologists were really late to come statistics and statistical analysis and the attribution of mathematical kinds of formula to explain human life. But anyway, we'll get to that in just a second. So following the inorganic level of reality then, there is an organic level of reality. And those of us on this planet should really be familiar with this one, because this has to do with the fact that so much of our environment is involved in an inorganic level of reality. Even if we're looking at things such as minerals and coal especially is one that comes to mind, because it represents organic reality from a long, long time ago in the tropical forests around the world. And remember, in the times we're talking about, tropical forests were much more widely spread. Changes have come about, even if you don't believe or subscribe to the notions of global warming. But the environments are very different today than they were in the time periods that coal, for example, became diamonds or something like that. But in that, and when we look at the world around us, so much of what is in our environment is organic in nature. When I was a chemistry major, we first studied chemistry, and then when you started specializing as a major, you first took inorganic chemistry, and then you moved to a more complicated course called organic chemistry, which made me shift my focus to philosophy and then anthropology. I couldn't take it. It was interesting, it was fascinating in some ways, but it was extremely, for my simple mind anyway, difficult. And I wasn't ready to invest that kind of time. I had more important things to do as a young person of 20 or 19 or something like that. But anyway, organic level of reality then is best studied. I'm giving you kind of a simplistic overview of this, actually. But it would be, say, chemistry, like I just said, and one that might be of interest to it. And it shows that psychology can be subdivided, but some subfields of psychology would also fit in here. Those that study the brain, for example, and the functions of the brain and the specialized areas of the brain and what it has to say about our behavior. A lot of that is in this kind of psychology. One of the most recent developments in the area of psychology, which has received a lot of press in the last, say, 5 years, is this evolutionary psychology, which I've talked about again in other classes, and represents, I think, a development from psychobiology and sociobiology of the 80s. It is also, I think, could be put in this organic level of reality. And then there is, and that's all this long-winded discussion, is to come to this point where I can place it in context for you. There is a super organic level of reality. And guess what goes there? In big old letters, anthropology. But look at what it means if you accept this scheme of development in terms of the areas of academic turfs. Anthropology, in some ways you can say, well, we got our own level of reality. But on the other hand, we lose because we're the least appropriate for utilizing the scientific method or the philosophy of science. Well, why is that? Because our object of study, no matter what kind of theoretical persuasion you happen to be, is humans and human behavior. I think that maybe should have been our humans and human behavior. But one way or the other, we'll get it out. So while we have our own level of reality, superorganic, it makes us less scientific. So if you look around, I always say there's a structure here that, for those of you who are a little more sophisticated, many of you are juniors and seniors now, you really know what the world is about, at least the university world, this university world, and you know that there are different turfs on this campus. And you can tell who has more clout by the building they're in and the territory and physical resources they have. And what has the most resources on this campus? The natural sciences and engineering. Nobody else comes close to that. Nobody else will come close to that. That is the byproduct of histories of development of Western civilization. That's why Paul Chu has his very own building. A renowned physicist on this campus. And who has maybe the least amount of resources? Well, it's not anthropology. It's somebody in the natural sciences and humanities, because there's also that larger area division. Natural science and mathematics, they're over here in this division, and they get the most resources, or they're allocated the larger set of resources. Social sciences is next, and fine arts and humanities is the third of this tripartite development, or distribution of wealth, if you will. And it represents this kind of early positivistic notion of appropriate divisions or turfs in academic history. It's a kind of history that you don't hear much about. I don't know if anyone ever teaches it. And you only can get it from a course like this, kind of indirectly, or looking underneath and coming out and seeing, well, why did they say what they were saying and whatever. But anyway, this is the superorganic. And now that's what this handout that I'm going to give you has to do with. And if you'll see here, the concept of the superorganic. And again, for those of you who are in our home viewing audience, we're going to try our best to get all these handouts on the internet as soon as we can. We haven't yet been able to do that. Either something is defying us, maybe our enemies today, whoever they might be, are trying to see we can't spread this knowledge around. But we're going to try to get it out there to you, and so and you will know where they belong by looking at your tapes, etc. So today we're talking about the concept of the superorganic, and I'm talking about it because I associate it with this anthropologist by the name of Alfred Kroeber. Alfred Kroeber was an anthropologist you probably know about and didn't know it, even if you're new to anthropology. Because Alfred Kroeber was the anthropologist that was involved with Ishi. There's been various films made of Ishi because he was the last of the certain group of Indians in California. And it kind of came into this century, and for a while, he kind of hung out in Kroeber's lab, which is, at the University of California in Berkeley. And they had a museum there, and they had, a Department of Anthropology. And at that particular university, they have a lot of resources in anthropology, so it kind of defies this little scheme I just gave you. I don't know why that is. Of course, Berkeley seems to have more resources than lots of other places do that's scattered throughout that university. But anyway, he's associated with that because he figured importantly in determining the fate of Ishi, I-S-H-I. Once in one role it was played by John Voight, And in another version of the movie in recent times, it was played by Dennis Weaver. If any of you remember Gunsmoke and Dennis Weaver and all those things, or he played some other characters as well. But more recently, he's kind of somewhere else now. I guess he's not acting any longer, or at least not that often. But anyway, Alfred Kroeber was really the foremost among the students of Franz Boas. If there's a pedigree in American anthropology, as opposed to the 19th century. Now we come into a period of time in which we can talk about the American School of Anthropology. If there is a line of development that is more important, up through the 80s anyway, in terms of pedagogy and intellectual development that we associate with American anthropology, it would be Boas, Big Daddy, big American anthropologist, primarily founding this school of anthropology that gave us, in many ways, an important point of view in anthropology, which we'll be talking about, which lasts to the present day. His foremost student is Alfred Cobra, and Kroeber's foremost student is Julian Stewart. So it takes us up almost to my generation then when we talk about that, and then succeeding generations, other things happen, and that'll be taking place in the rest of the course. But anyway, Alfred Cobra, that kind of places him for you. But way back in 1915, Cobra was always writing things about history and anthropology, and if anthropology is just history, then why have anthropology? Why not just have history? But again, remember the history at this time was the recovery of fact. It wasn't a more recent notion of, say, the social reconstruction of history. Anyway, he sums up his own theoretical view, and I got this from a book that I used to use in this course by Herbert Applebaum called Perspectives in Cultural Anthropology at the State University of New York Press in 1987. On page 64, he writes, and again, this is on that handout that hopefully will be shown soon to the home audience. There they go. Civilization, and no, he's still capitalizing civilization. It still has that mystery to it, or that degree of importance attributed to it by the 19th century. It's whatever. Civilization is really important. It's not just that it's the first word in the sentence, because in the quote that I'm taking it from, this wasn't the first word in the sentence. Though carried by men and existing through them, is an entity in itself and of another order from life. An entity in itself, or you could say even unto itself, and of another order from life. And the author or the editor of that book goes on to say that the above statement presages Kroeber's concept of the superorganic. And what I want to tell you is that there was a preceding concept of the superorganic that was put forth by Spencer. So it also belongs appropriately in the 19th century as well, and it belongs in this Boasian school of anthropology and the subsequent cultural ecology or cultural materialist point of view in the work of Stewart. All three points of view, which are major points of view in the historical development of anthropology, make reference to this notion or this concept of the superorganic. And it's sometimes something that defies my own understanding of it. But I'm still going to try to talk to you about it for a little bit, not long. Anyway, he goes on to say, Applebaum does, that this statement kind of gives us an introduction to Kroeber's major concept of the superorganic. He really felt, and as it says here, that he was essentially concerned with human beings in groups and communities and not with individuals. That's important to recognize, that sometimes that is the division of anthropology as it gets expressed between, say, in the humanistic tradition versus the materialist. It really has to do with that very statement. It has to do with how do you view looking at human groups around the world. Do you emphasize that there are generalizations, abstract notions that you can make, that's part of that scientific method, that you can make about the level of reality that you're focusing on, human behavior? Do you think that you need to not talk about individual human beings? And I'm pointing to students in the class to make sense here. I'm not trying to emphasize a point. Or is it important that you always keep the individual in mind? again, these are polar opposites in terms of the points of view. Both are always in anthropology. Both are a necessary part of, they're both voices, I would guess, of anthropology instead of both parts of the same voice of anthropology. But, any anthropologist is somewhere around, they adhere to either one end of this polar distribution or another, or the other. And obviously Kroeber's at the other end. He's at the end away from the individual. And he thinks that what anthropologists should be primarily concerned with then is talking about human groups and abstracting from that, levels of discussion and generalization that are appropriate to communities or nations or whatever, and not with individuals. He thinks that individuals are unimportant, and you'll see how that works out in this anthropology of Boas and the American school. In a way, it puts him in the area of those folks who contribute to this discussion of the superorganic, and it makes it within this discussion then also of the larger notions of the philosophy of science and how you discuss that. But at the same time, it caused problems, as we'll talk about later. It was when Kroeber, again, further in this handout, when he was talking about when it comes time for human beings, and is expressed by human beings, in other words, behavior, culture has, he says, its own characteristics that are above and beyond individual human beings. You can even add individual there, except it makes it kind of repetitive. And it was when Kroeber seemed to suggest that culture as a superorganic phenomenon had a life of its own that his notion became challenged. At the same time, though, that he was developing these notions, his own writings about the superorganic, which again are a derivative of Spencer's notions of the superorganic, there were historians that kind of supported this point of view. Two of them I'll mention that you may have heard of, Spengler and Toynbee. If you take their view of history, which is very different than the Boasians, you'll see that they talked about levels of chapters in history, or whatever you want to talk about, that were much more important than individuals. In other words, they had a kind of a superorganic quality to them. So at the same time that Kroeber was writing these kinds of ideas down in anthropology, historians were writing very similar kinds of ideas in history. And these historians would come up with these notions of, there are kinds of chapters in history that are larger than any one historical group, any one identifiable group historically. And they would come in kinds of waves, and they would they would come again later. They would go out of fashion and come back into fashion, and that's the way it was, and that's the way they talked about it. And they're talking about really the large sweeps or generalization that one can make about history and past historical phenomena. Anyway, Kroeber, along with these historians then, felt, because since he's now dead, that culture is a transcendental metaphysical entity which has made man what he is and to which he will conform as part of his culture, his upbringing, and his heritage. As you read later authors in this class, you will find this idea expressed in other quarters, principally by such eminent anthropologists as Leslie White and Julian Stewart. Julian Stewart also talks about the superorganic. It's that aspect of Julian Stewart's theory which I find incomprehensible. And someone in our home viewing audience who may know Stewart better than I may be able to come back and tell me, well, it shouldn't be incomprehensible. You should have known that because you're a student of Stewart's, etc. I find it incomprehensible because, again, it almost goes back to this Morgan notion of that there is built into our psyches kind of this necessary unfolding. And if any anthropologist is to be cited that would get us away from that 19th century notion of historical and prehistorical development, it should be Julian Stewart, who looks to environment as the most important source of shapers of history and prehistory that give us the variation that occurs among human groups. But anyway, those folks, all these folks are superorganicists one degree or another, and when we have occasion to talk about them, some of you will be talking about Leslie White and Julian Stewart in your class presentations. And if you choose them, and if those are the areas of presentation that you do, you will, I hope, include this discussion of the superorganic. And that's that handout. Again, for those of you in the class, you'll be getting it. Don't worry about whether you got the notes on it. And for those of you in our home audience, you will be getting it when we finally discover the mystery of putting something on the internet for this class. And hopefully that's going to be today. And whatever. So now, having gotten the superorganic out of the way, because again, I thought it was important to give you that in the kind of this pantheon of ideas that we keep presenting, because it transcends any one generation of anthropologists. It transcends any one generation of scientists, actually, or scholars, in the sense that it seems to keep revisiting us in different forms, in different generations of scholars. So it was important, I think, to present that to you, because it is a part of the 19th century, almost as much as it is, or becomes more important, or at least more discussed by scholars in the current or 20th century, especially from the turn of the century through the, again, 70s and 80s. And I would imagine it would be coming back shortly in one form or another. Okay. We go now to, remember in the beginning of the class, I talked about there were 3 chapters in history that we're going to cover up to the midterm. One was the classical evolutionists. Another was a period of intermittent liberal reform. We're now to that period of intermittent liberal reform. Again, in terms of the larger cultural context, this has to do with of the 20th century. It has to do with the incoming dominance, say, of the Democratic Party in terms of our own cultural context. It has to do with going towards another set of ideas. It has to do with kind of coming away from capitalism, going more towards scholars who might in later times be associated with socialism. It has to do with promoting the interests of the individual as opposed to the interests of the state. I mean, this is the controversy that goes on, isn't it? Even today in terms of politics. Which is more important, the interests of the state or the interests of the individual? Many times, you can see where both Democrats and Republicans, not to bias the argument one way or the other, kind of extract from both ends of that polarity. But anyway, it's important, and it is the context in which the 20th century is ushered in terms of anthropological ideas and development. This is also the time when the suffragettes were becoming important in terms of creating rights and changing at least America's view and maybe Europe's view of women in the world as humans. I mean, you've got to remember how quickly all this has changed. In the latter part of the 19th century, women in this country were seen as less than. They weren't second-class citizens. They were akin to being no citizens because they weren't seen as being fully human. At least if you read some of the writings of that 19th century. And it isn't that these people were silly. It's just that the extent of human rights had not been extended to women at this time. They were an appropriate group to exclude because, after all, they were dependent on the men folk, and that was a necessary structure of reality at that time, as 19th century and even early 20th century and even current folks in some quarters. So suffragettes and women's rights were a big thing coming at this time. America was spent a lot of time examining itself. It was coming into a period of time in which as due to the First World War and subsequently the Second World War, it became more involved with looking at cultural diversity. Not multiculturalism, that's a 90s thing. At this time, I think we can call it diversity, or we can call it that Americans generally were becoming aware that their way of viewing things, their way of looking at things, was not the only way of looking at things, not the only way of examining the world, that there were other perspectives just as important, just as valid, and very interesting. So, there was this kind of scholarship or emphasis in scholarship to study other points of view, other ways of looking at things, and realizing that there were many different folks out there, and they were different than we were, but they were nonetheless human. And they were, it was a matter of bringing them into our roster of interests and our inventory of study, or whatever you want to call it. These are things that are occurring then on the national scene or even the international scene. This is when America as our own country was moving away from an isolationist perspective to a non-isolationist perspective. And I think you still see that polarity exist within our national psyche, if there is such a thing. Our own struggles many times politically have to do with whether that we want to become protectionist and American, say in terms of Buchanan type politics, or whether we want to become more concerned with the international perspective and seeing the United States as one country among many nations, which I would think would be more the Gore and maybe even to a certain extent the Bush point of view. That's why they're called centrists, because they have this, whether they're Democrat or Republican, they seem to have this notion that America has a role to play in the world, and it shouldn't just be, talking about its own narrow-minded interests, because actually our bigger interests economically and politically is to be involved internationally, and that's how we have achieved, at least in this century, the preeminent view that we have achieved is that we have involved ourselves in the affairs of other countries and of the world. So that's going on, and that's developing in this century, and that's a departure from the 19th century. Those chapters in the preceding century, those developments of slavery, those developments of industrialization, those developments of, what else did we talk about? Laissez-faire, capitalism as an ideology. Some of that has remained with us. Some of it has become somewhat transformed in this century. But nonetheless, I think many of you, being students as you are at a university at this time, have been made more than aware by recent publications that we continue to be a racist society. And that doesn't mean I'm speaking for racism, as sometimes people misconstrue what I'm saying. I'm saying that as a member of this society, being brought up in a time period in which I was born in 1938, so I kind of cover most of this 20th century and will hopefully survive in the 21st, I am by definition a racist. If you mean by racism a person who grows up at a certain time and takes on those points of view, it doesn't mean that I personally have racist attitudes. I just know that I do. And it's a constant struggle for me to push them aside. It's kind of an admitting it, you get rid of them. If you don't admit that you have them, you're going to remain at a level of consciousness about racism that people are trying or attempting to engage in a kind of a national dialogue about, that Americans have to become more aware of this. But anyway, this is a contribution that's going on this century, and a lot of that became refined for us or thrown into focus because of our involvement in other areas of the world, because, people from the farms in Indiana and the heartland of this nation suddenly found themselves in France and in Japan and in Southeast Asia in the Second World War and in some of those same areas in the First World War, and suddenly discovered that that it really did transform American society, because all those folks came home and they knew about those differences, and as they say, well, I'm not going to go to those silly cliches, but it made a lasting impact. It has changed what is American society, and I think in some ways has given rise to this national debate or dialogue on racism, and it's an important one, and it colors what anthropologists will be saying and the kinds of theoretical developments they're going to be coming up with in your generation of anthropology, because this is what you're going to be responding to, whether you realize it now or not. At least that's the way I see it. And industrialization, as I already talked about, in the present generation has come to be discussions of, today what I find most fascinating is the technological impact of both computers and electronics. And that, it's when you start thinking about it, the impact is tremendous, thorough, and totally unknown. because nobody is. I mean, there's some books that have been written on it, but when you, as I say, when you're in the middle of it, you don't really know what's just a little fad and what will become a strong trend when historians look back at this time. But certainly, it is increasing a lot of these Western notions and these ideas and concepts that had to do with the development of the individual. And in the 20th century, you'll see this shift, both in terms of politics and in terms of theoretical ideas. And you'll see them shifting from these notions of the uniformity of social organization, the standardization of behavior that came with the industrialization of this society, and you'll later see then a return to individualism in your own discussions of theory and development as espoused or viewed in more recent theoretical viewpoints in anthropology and indeed in the Western world. But again, you have these notions that are larger than anthropology that are going on. And so you have industrialization, and then finally you have these notions of human rights that have come center stage and have contributed a great deal to a discussion of the cultural happenings of this century. And again, it's this cultural context of all these things of becoming much more sophisticated citizens of the world, etc., that you have to place the anthropology of today. Thank you very much, and I'll see you on Thursday.